Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Indeed it is. Here we go. It's May 29 as we record this episode of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. Welcome in. I'm Dave Trafford, and lots to talk about. It's a busy week for the pods because this week we'll also be talking to Lindsay Broadhead, Bob Reed, Anne-Marie Aikens, the cast, the comms and strategy team going to sit around the table at Now and Next this week. So make sure you drop in on that. And I had a rather interesting and insightful discussion with retired Major General Scott Clancy, RCAF, former, among other things, the director of operations at NORAD when he finished his career a couple of years ago. And he brings a really interesting perspective on all the conversation this past week, particularly against the backdrop of the throne speech and Canadian sovereignty, Canadian security, all of those sorts of things, the Gold Dome. So Scott will be in the feed as well. So all the more reason. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And, well, then you just kind of have to wait for the notifications and drop in, put an ear on it, watch it, however you consume your podcasting. So that'd be great. All right, let's get around the table here. It's On the Ledge, and we welcome in John Wright. He is our veteran pollster, founding pollster for On the Ledge. Kathleen Wynne, former Premier of Ontario, here as well. Keith Leslie, you see and hear him on CHTV as a Queen's Park commentator. And Tim Hudak, partner at Council Public Affairs, and also the former leader of the PC party and dad of the track star. Now, what leave us hanging last week where, you were heading to the track meet last week, got rained out. It was supposed to be set for this week. What's going on?
And, I was worried it would be today, right? Because we got the podcast in the morning, Then I'm heading to London to meet with some clients, doing a full day there, and taking Miller, by the way, to a synchronized swimming competition. So Dad, I can spend some time in the car together today. Good news. It's Monday, which is perfect. So Rob Ford Stadium, Maitland is lining up, finished first in long jump in the regional, second in the 4x100 meter. So we're looking forward to Monday, and I'll update you next week on how she did.
There you go. Well, we'll want lots of good Instagram pictures from the site. So running across, cutting through the tape, all that kind of stuff.
You bet.
Good deal of excitement. Part of the conversation we had last week, Kathleen Wynne, we got into it around Bill 5. And I suggested in the discussion that Bill 5 is kind of this anonymous piece of legislation. Typically, nobody would really, it wouldn't be top of mind for so many people around general conversation. And when the legislature went to constituency week, past week, it would appear as though the media had all kinds of time to dig in on Bill 5, that stakeholders had all kinds of opportunity to catch media's attention, that is, on Bill 5. And so all of a sudden, during the constituency week, there seemed to be an elevated concern and elevated attention to this omnibus bill around, getting things built faster and farther and all that sort of thing for Ontarians. At the heart of it, whether it's the minds that sort of kind of take the lead on the conversation, or whether it's the tunnel under the 401, it's all about consultation with community and building infrastructure faster. I suggested that maybe it was a strategic mistake for the government to do that prior to constituency week, to let everybody kind of dig in on the weeds and really figure out what's going on, because then they began to pile on. So we saw a little bit of that last week, and then the committee meetings started. Well, now here we are a week later, and the government is in a place now where they're not only having to deal with amendments to this because of consultation with First Nations, particularly around the Ring of Fire, et cetera, but there is a real push to scrap it and start all over again, if all. Where does this go in the next week? I mean, realistically, the government is saying they want to push this forward. We want to get it done before the House rises, which is the 5th of June. That seems to be an inordinately short period of time to put out all the fires on this.
Yeah, so when I wasn't able to join you guys last week because of my dental surgery, I did listen to the committee hearings on Bill 5. And I heard in the pod that you talked a little bit about that. So I like to think, Dave, that even if it hadn't been constituency week before that, and even if there hadn't been much focus on it, the committee hearings and the debate in the House would have brought the issues to the fore. And from my perspective, the issue is that there was not enough work done in the lead up to this bill. There wasn't enough consultation. There wasn't enough consideration of the First Nation and Indigenous concerns that it would have been pretty easy to predict were going to arise. And so now the government finds itself in this situation. And it's not just Indigenous people who are up in arms about the lack of consultation. The community where there's a dormant landfill site is in Chatham, Kent, I think it is raising the flag that this is not okay. And the local member, who is a conservative, as you guys have talked about, is opposed. So there was a lot of lack of consultation. There are a lot of gaps in the relationships around the people who are concerned about this legislation. So I would not be surprised to see them put it off until the fall. Now, maybe that's not going to happen. Maybe he will ram it through. They're obviously retreating because they're bringing in amendments. But what I'm hearing from people who are opposed, particularly, again, First Nations communities, is that it's not enough. It's too little. It's too late. And they needed the work to have been done before. It's a pretty low bar to say that they are going to, live up to their responsibilities to consult and look for consent, because that's the table stakes in terms of working with First Nations and Indigenous people in this province. So I think it's a mess, but it's a mess of this government's own making. And I will just end with this, that this is a pattern for this government, that they go out guns a-blazing, they think they can get away with whatever they want, and then they backtrack and they are, they're apologetic, and they act as though they had nothing but the best intentions when they know perfectly well that the work should have been done up front. So it's no way to govern a province.
Tim, the whole idea of the amendments was sort of floated by the Energy Minister, Stephen Lecce. And then I think it was Minister Rickford was talking about, when we put the amendments in there, it's going to require the consultation. But the line, to some degree, just didn't ring to me effectively to say, well, we have to pass the legislation before we can do consultation. So then we can kind of really get into this conversation. And then the premier almost dismissing all of it by saying it's only the left-wing extremists who are really opposed to any of this legislation. So there's a little bit of scramble on the messaging side of it. But if they go through with this, and they push it through in this current state it's in, given the backlash, it might be a long, hot, difficult summer for the Ford government, considering some of the not so veiled threats of civil disobedience that's going on out there.
Yeah, I'm just on a different page, honestly. Remember that movie Wag the Dog, and Dustin Hoffman's famous line, "This is nothing. This is nothing." I'm not being dismissive here. What I'm saying, this is actually part of the legislative process when you're making long overdue change, and the longer change is put off, sometimes the harder it gets. Right? You campaign in poetry, you govern in prose, and we're in that transition right now. The underlying goals of Bill 5 make tremendous sense, right? To actually tap into our mineral resources, create really high-paying jobs. The notion of overriding Indigenous rights is not a question. It's a constitutional guarantee. Plus, I expressed last week, it's practical. Every mining company or forestry company or anybody in the resource sector understands that if you don't have the Indigenous populations on side, you ain't getting anywhere. So I think that this is actually typical of what happens with a majority government that has a powerful mandate and wants to make major change. I referenced to Dustin Hoffman. I went through a lot of this in 1995, right through about 98, 99, where we started slowing down. They'll make the adjustments. They have significant funds to support Indigenous communities, make sure they share in the benefits that's already happening around the Ring of Fire with prosperity sharing agreements. I think this will settle, right? I think there will be amendments, no doubt about it. But this is part of the pros of governing when you're making major change. The aggressive target, you'll back off and find, I think, a happy middle.
But isn't the issue here, Tim, is much around, and I think generally the chiefs who were at Queen's Park this week made it abundantly clear. It's not that we're against the underlying need for this bill to go through. It's the part about consultation and their own benefits. And then with that, part of the expressed concern was having these special zones where the government can go in and decide that we're not going to we're going to change the rules or ignore the rules. And in municipalities, that's one thing, certainly First Nations. But part of it was, and it might have been a little nuanced, but it came down to their current agreements with industry. So where the First Nations had gone out with private sector and made, deals or had some kind of agreement in terms of how resources were going to be managed or extracted, et cetera. Aside and apart from whatever government was involved in, the worry was that the government was going to get involved and say, no, you can't do that either, that they would override even those that are working some of those conversations. So they seem to have kind of tripped over that intentionally, unintentionally, I don't know, the blind spot, whatever it might be. But it seemed to me that this should have been easy to fix before we got to this point.
Maybe. But there's a real fever, which I think is welcomed in a third-term government, to make major change in the face of the Trump tariffs, make structural changes to actually fix things that aren't working. And yeah, I think that there's an exuberance there, but I see a government that's actually listening and figuring out, okay, the pendulum had swung so far in this direction that you could get nothing built, and resources were staying on the ground, jobs were lost, capital's moving elsewhere. The bill, I think, swings it back the opposite direction. I believe it's going to fall into balance. I like the direction, and I'm not fussed on overreach. So I think it's going to settle. And here's why. The practical I already explained, that you have to work with Indigenous communities. That's just a fact of nature that everybody knows. That will settle. Secondly, one of the very influential regional chiefs was meeting with Doug Ford at his home, which is where sometimes these one-on-one conversations happen, and then you see changes as a result. And the pattern of the Ford government tends to be to go in a particular direction. If they're running too fast, they'll hit the brakes and they'll move back. Whether that's the prettiest, smoothest way of running government, no, but it's not uncharacteristic of a early part of a government's term when they've got an aggressive mandate to deliver. It'll settle.
So, Keith, if we look at the way this is unfolded for Bill 5, and to points that Kathleen and Tim have both made, that there is an opportunity here to sort of dial this back. My sense is, when most people look at this and say underlying the need for this, people would agree with it. People would generally side with Tim's view on it and say, the delays, the time it takes, all of the permitting, all of the nonsense, the 3 or 4 levels of scrutiny and bureaucracy that you have to go through to get all of this done, and how long it takes, et cetera, all that exhaustion and frustration. Most people would say, okay, I agree with avoiding that. I'm going to guess that if the Ford government backs off on this, and as Kathleen Wynne says, maybe we, fix it up, fine tune it, reintroduce it in September, Ford gets a pass on that. If he can kind of comb over some of this, the bald spots in the legislation, so to speak.
Well, to your point, something has to be done about the process taking, more than a decade to get a 4.5-inch drill or a hole drill. But I disagree with Tim that this is a regular part of the process, in that a regular part of the process would have been smartly consulting the First Nations before you introduce the bill. I mean, that's just simply a no-brainer, given the areas we're talking about here. And for the government to come out now and say, oh, we'll put amendments in for you, we didn't realize you'd be so upset. Well, of course, it was very predictable what their reaction would be, and that their threats would be, more blockades and stuff if they don't get consulted. And the government said, well, we'll fix it in the regulations. Well, there's no trust left because you didn't consult in the first place as a government. You just blew that whole spider. So fixing in the regulations is not something that's going to be done. The amendments as well, do not speak at all to the fact, as one critic pointed out, that the Premier and the Cabinet will remain with unfettered authoritarian power to exempt every friend or business or donor they choose from every provincial and municipal law they choose in every part of the province they choose for whatever reason they choose. And what have they done to try and bring the First Nations on side? We'll give you the power to create special economic zones as well. Is that really the way to go, to give more people the power to exempt more laws, or do we need something of a better process? I'm not sure that the government is on the right track with this, but I do think they will try and ram it through, even though the NDP are claiming that they've managed to delay the bill enough. There will have to be another committee day of hearing next week, that they're going to be able to extend it beyond today. The government has tried twice to stop the committee holding a hearing in Thunder Bay. But they really don't want to stretch it out. The government, or the NDP, says they've managed to delay it at least till next week. But I still think the government is going to ram it through before the recess, which is at the end of next week, because they do want this on side. And of course, we've seen Prime Minister Carney signal that he as well wants one process, a 2-year limit for getting the project shovels into the ground, as it were. So I think we're going to see the provincial government want to show that they're leading on this plan. They've got a plan to deal with this, and that they want the federal government, is on side with them on that. So I think absolutely they're going to push this through.
Well, John, it's worth noting, based on what Keith just said, the premiers and the prime minister meeting next week, and they'll kind of get into more of this. But I thought it was interesting to see that the Globe and Mail, there was a piece that suggested, Ford and Carney have the same goal here, but they're going at it completely differently. And they looked at what was happening with Bill 5 at Queen's Park, but then Carney talking about, well, we're going to consult, but they only gave the chiefs in James Bay, 10 days or something to respond to whatever plan that the federal government was putting up. So I guess relatively speaking, the federal plan looks more consultative than it does at Queen's Park, but really 10 days to kind of sort through all the worms in the can. I don't know, but either way, that's going to be part of the conversation when they meet next week.
Well, I share the view with some of my colleagues on this. People are tired of having to wait so long to get things done. But I also take a look at this and say that promise plus pace equals pushback. And you can go to Ottawa. I was there for the last couple of days, and you can feel the vibe on the ground that the Prime Minister's got momentum. He wants to get things done. He's a very buttoned down guy, and the pressure in the Prime Minister's office itself is very almost relentless in terms of moving forward. But what's changed, except some personalities that say, because of what's happening south of the border, we have to get things done now. Nothing else has changed. There are now 3 leaders of various Indigenous nations who are on the record of saying ain't going to happen. We're talking, in Ontario, where there's even the threat of confrontation on the ground. So I echo what I said last week. If we really wanted to be in this place, we would have got all of these people in some way, shape, or form together over the last 18 months. And maybe, Tim, that's been happening. I don't know. But it seems to me that we always come up against these situations where we got to do it. We're moving ahead, which then has pressure points of pushback, obstructionism, takeovers of railways, all that sort of stuff that happens. But then the infighting within the groups themselves take place too. I was surprised that Mr. Carney says we're going to move forward with this, only gives 10 days notice to the Indigenous chiefs, and doesn't have someone like Mark Miller, who had the trust of the Indigenous groups, very much so, even had learned to speak Cree, and say, look, you're not in cabinet, but we're going to make you a special envoy to go out and talk to these people and give yourself a couple of months. Just because Donald Trump has said that he's going to do certain things, and I guess it's questionable on the tariff front even now, given the judge's ruling, doesn't give you carte blanche to kind of steamroll and move forward. So I get the momentum view, but I don't see anything that's changed fundamentally in terms of process that was happening 6 months or 8 months ago. I don't see it. And I think you're going to come up against great confrontation. So I may not be in favor of the confrontation. I'm just recognizing that that's the terrain that I think governments are going to have to deal with.
Yeah, Kathleen, part of the conversation that preceded this, in terms of Bill 5 even being up the top of the agenda conversationally, has been, well, there will be a conflict between Doug Ford and Prime Minister Carney, because Carney will not kind of have the loose, shoot from the hip idea around how we're going to deal with consultation and the environment, et cetera. The feds were going to somehow be a check on what went on at Queen's Park. Right now, there's not a whole lot of daylight between the two of them in terms of how they're proceeding.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me not to think about sitting in the community meeting place, the big, like a gym in the community of Grassy Narrows, and listening to the families who'd been affected by mercury poisoning for a couple of generations because of the mercury from Domtar that was in the river, that was in their water source, that was in their fish. So, this is, yes, this is about getting mines going. This is about getting the permits in place. This is about streamlining. It's about, not having duplication at the federal and the provincial level. All of that is fine. It's why I sat for 2 years off and on, David Zimmer, my Minister of Indigenous Relations, and I sat for 2 years with the Matawa First Nations chiefs to try to get to the point where we could get a road built, the infrastructure to the Ring of Fire. And we did get agreement with 2 First Nations. That process really hasn't advanced very much since 2018. It's the same 2 First Nations that the Ford government has got agreement with in terms of that road. So what I really am worried about, Dave, is that whether it's the federal level or it's the provincial level, we have to do 2 things. We have to understand that the relationships between governments, so the government to government relationship between the federal government and the First Nations government, the provincial government and the First Nations governments, those are real. That's a real expectation. It's not some frivolous part of a reconciliation call. It is real that government to government relationship needs to exist. And then the second thing is that there is information in First Nations communities who are going to be affected by the mining that is done that will not affect us in the South in the same way. And we need to pay attention to that information. I take Tim's point that, the relationships between the companies and the community members is necessary and does happen. But what the government permits is also important. And that's what this discussion is about. And if we don't get it right, our time frame will be irrelevant to those First Nations. They are not operating with the same urgency in terms of getting those minerals out of the ground, because they've lived through things like Grassy Narrows. They've seen the degradation. They've lived with the degradation, and we better pay attention to that. We better pay attention to their calls for their control over permitting or their involvement in permitting and their equity stake in this, both in financial and in social terms.
Well, it's interesting, Tim, when we start talking about the urgency around the timeline, et cetera. And recently, in the last couple of years, we've done a fair amount of work with Indigenous, the Inuit, First Nations communities across the country on a variety of files. And one of the things I learned is that the traditional wisdom of the First Nations has been, and Indigenous people has been now almost viewed as modern Western science. It's the new science, because we've learned how to, deal with some of the environmental issues based on the way it would have happened, hundreds and thousands of years ago, for those who were here first. And so it's interesting. And when I asked about that, the ethic is they look 7 generations back and they look 7 generations forward. And that's how they kind of come to their overarching view of where we're going to be in terms of how do we actually manage our environment, our relationship with the planet, et cetera. So to Kathleen's point, that can't be dismissed. Like, we've got to kind of take that into account, that traditional view of their relationship with the environment. That's one thing. The second thing is, somebody brought up this past week, is all this conversation going on. We need to remember that these are sovereign nations in Canada in terms of the First Nations. So that gets lost in the discussion too. So, it's almost as if the conversation vis-a-vis Indigenous communities becomes something over here as opposed to at the table.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And sorry, I just take that as table stakes. And when I talk to, ministers involved with this, they get that too. We spoke last week, and I'll reinforce Agnico Eagle, for example, great Canadian company headquartered here in Toronto, run by Canadians, has developed an excellent reputation by working closely with Indigenous peoples. Or Projects Northwest Territory, is a model. The projects in Ontario, I had the honor of serving as mines minister. I try to stay on top of those files, with the Ontario Mining Association, leading mining companies. And they all get that if you don't have Indigenous communities as true partners from the get-go through the development to jobs, share of the revenue, you're just not going to get anywhere. I think people really fundamentally understand that. I'll go back to my gut on this, whether it's pattern recognition or just an understanding of the practicality of this government. You need to inject some tension to the system. I think most of that tension is actually going to come from the municipal side and moving towards a, one project, one approval process. That makes tremendous sense. I think this will hit level ground, but I do agree you need to be aggressive out of the gate to move the conversation forward because we've been stuck in neutral for far too long.
Go ahead, John.
Well, no, as I stated from the outset, I'm of Tim's view that things have taken too long, that we have to move forward. But I mean, even bike lanes being removed in Toronto are being held up in a court for review because a group of cyclists have decided to challenge the charter. Okay, so here we have one of the hotbeds of conflict in this country. As I said, not just between levels of government and Indigenous people, but within the Indigenous community itself. And here we have governments making the same mistake that's gone on and on and on, which has led to the same kind of confrontation before. And that is, hey, nationally, I'm the prime minister and you got 10 days to respond to this. Good luck. See you later. You have the Ford government that comes in with legislation saying, here you go. Let's see if we can push this through. Oh, let's make an amendment at the last minute and see if you can live with that. So the past is prologue, right? I've always wondered whether there is a way in which there's a way to get the people who would object most to this on side beforehand and put some mechanism in place, because there's a lot of vested interests here. Absolutely. Who wouldn't want to have access to $3 billion to try and clean up the mess that you've had from before, or to take advantage to build communities for the future? But I think it's really naive to sort of think that we're not going to have challenges by Indigenous leaders who have already said that we could have on the ground confrontation, which we've witnessed before in this country numerous times, or that we're going to have protests, in different parts of the country, which stop this dead in its tracks. So I agree with Tim that this is where governments go with these issues, that there is tension that exists, but we haven't apparently done much to resolve it. And the evidence from even the last month or so in the introduction of a piece of legislation, a letter from the Prime Minister saying, hey, I'm meeting with the premiers really shortly. Here's 10 days for your input. I'm sorry, but I don't think anybody should be putting their surprise face on when, in fact, a month or two from now, we've got like major confrontation between the very groups that you've tried to buy into the process. So I share the enthusiasm for getting stuff done, but it just seems to me that we could be headed for a pretty protracted time ahead.
Well, it should be no surprise that the First Nations don't want to be on our timetable with this. Exactly. And Kathleen mentioned Grassy Narrows. There's a perfect example. Dave, you said about something being over there. Well, there's a story. I would venture most Ontarians and most Canadians know virtually nothing about what went on in Grassy Narrows. That the mercury leaching into their river system poisoned generations. Minimata disease, nowhere else in the world but Japan and Grassy Narrows. This is just stunning, and yet most people don't even know about it, and it's gone on for generations. They have an absolute right to be fearful of what we're going to do when we go in with these mining projects. What is there, 40,000 state claims in the area of the Ring of Fire? Of course they're fearful of what's going to happen here. What's going to happen to the environment when the muskeg, when everything else gets dug up, when we're digging down, when we're creating mines, creating new roads. they just can't look at this as something that, well, we got to get this done within a year or within 2 years. We need, our economy needs this right now. Their economy needs generations of sustainability. They need to be able to work on that land and stay on that land because it's their sacred lands. And for us to think that we can just, run over this, to John's point about, there's court cases, charter challenges over bike lanes. Do we not think there's going to be the same thing here? Absolutely, there will be, and there will have to be, because the First Nations have some genuine concerns that are just not being addressed at all by this government. Even though, we're going to make amendments, we're going to do this. What about the long-term impacts? I mean, this is where their fears are, is another grassy narrows. And I think it's a very realistic fear because we just don't know the impact that all this activity, this mining activity in particular, the road building, all of it is going to have on that territory. And again, it's treated because it's the far north. It's just not affecting us here in Southern Ontario. And that, I think, makes a huge difference. People should know more about Grassy Narrows. And perhaps all of this will allow First Nations to get the Grassy Narrows story out, told more, and more exposure. And people would understand more why they are so concerned about why they want delays in consultations when these projects come to their territories.
Kathleen Wynne, is this not a sort of a David Coletto throws the line around all the time? Can you have good politics and good policy at the same time? And this seems to me to be those two things just running head on into each other.
Well, I believe you can have good politics and good policy, but you have to have good relationships. That's the third leg of the stool, as far as I'm concerned. Without good relationships and without an ongoing understanding of each other, then the policy and the politics are going to be challenging. One or the other is going to be challenging. I had a chief say to me once when I was premier that, they knew, he and his people knew that at some point, because his grandfather had said to him, at some point, white people are going to turn around to us and they're going to ask us for help. And he was saying to me, maybe we're coming to that time, or maybe it's going to be sometime in the future. To Keith's point about the fear in the First Nations community and the Indigenous community about what the government may or may not do to the environment, we should all take that seriously. It's not just about the people, who live in the immediate area. We all should take seriously the environmental concerns. And there are lots of examples where, had we paid more attention, I think about Kashechewan, where there's regular flooding in the spring. And I remember sitting in the band office in Kashechewan and listening to one of the elders talk about how when the federal government, Canada's federal government, came and they were relocated to that place on the shore of James Bay, the elders said, well, you can't put the water intake there. It's too low. There's going to be sediment in the water. And sure enough, the water has not been clean. It's been a challenge for years, and there's flooding every year. We have not listened. We have not built a strong relationship. And I think, we're repeating that story again, certainly with this legislation in Ontario. And it's like we haven't learned a thing, and it's very frustrating.
I know there'll be nobody have an opinion on this, but I'll just drop it in just so for the sake of touching on it. We're led to believe that the Ontario government is going to introduce legislation that will give the education minister more say over school boards. Kathleen Wynne, I know you don't want to talk about this, but
no, you don't want me to talk about it.
But there's a whole lot based on the reporting from Canadian Press in there that suggests there is some urgency around this. I don't know whether it's manufactured or not, but again, I get back to the agenda around this. It sounds like this, we're talking about speeding Bill 5 through in the next 8 days. I don't know if this is the intention is to have this passed before the legislature rises for the summer or not, but holy cow. So again, back to good policy or good politics. Kathleen?
Well, it's lousy on both fronts as far as I'm concerned. It's a great distraction from underfunding the boards to the tune of $700 to $1,500 a student. So it distracts from that debate. as I have read the reporting on the legislation, I haven't actually seen the document, but the reporting on the legislation, they talk about the government being able to supervise boards for other than just fiscal mismanagement. That's already in the Education Act because we put it in. Where there was dysfunction on the board, there already is the ability for the government to go in. So I think this is this government wanting to hold up yet another bully tactic on they've undermined the reputation of school boards by holding up there's been some really stupid moves on the part of a few school boards in the last little while. No doubt about it. Going to Italy to buy a statue. I mean, ridiculous. I absolutely accept that. But I think that they're just going down the wrong road to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think that having school boards is important in terms of families navigating the system. I think that expecting that MPPs will be able to take on every concern that families have in a community about what's going on in the schools is a big mistake. And I also think, and the final thing I'll say is I think that having school boards with local issues, coming up with local solutions actually can help in the overall running of boards across the province. I think that kind of comparison actually can be healthy. But this government hates school boards. The provincial Conservative government before this government hated school boards. They want to get rid of them. They're trying to undermine them. This is just another step in that direction. I think it's wrongheaded, and I think we will all regret it in the long run.
Well, it might otherwise be good politics, though, Tim, because I think generally speaking, when you look at it, people will look at school boards and you just generally don't see how they function to add value to the system. I mean, I appreciate it at the local level, as Kathleen points out, that there are some circumstances where, parents and teachers can actually get to the heart of a matter that's very specifically local. I mean, you were, or you still are, on parent when you're in school, and so those kinds of things I think are important locally. But overarching, my sense is, and anecdotal or not, is that most people would say, I don't even know who the hell the trustee is in my area. I don't vote for them. We're not engaged with it. So if we need reform, I'm all for it.
There's a line about something cannot go on forever. It'll eventually come to an end. And I think we're coming to that point on school boards and the province of Ontario. And a lot of it, in my view, is the result of their own actions. Look, I know that the Ford government did around the cabinet table discuss whether they wanted to go down the aggressive path of getting rid of school boards altogether. It was viewed that would take too many calories, considering so many other things that they need to address, particularly on the economy and the threat of tariffs. But major reform long overdue. And I think that a significant number of folks that are watching on the ledge or in the public today think our school board system is badly, badly broken and in need of repair. And this is demonstrated by whether it was under the PC government I was part of, under Premier Wynne's government, Premier McGuinty, and now Ford. Consistently and at an increasing rate, the province is sending in investigators or supervisors to take over boards. It is a rickety machinery that I don't think a small tweak is going to fix. And if you look at any of those reports, Dave, about what had gone wrong, there are extraordinary governance issues, trustees who don't know the role between being a strategic advisor, a strategic board, versus getting into operations. There's issues around nepotism, around the way contracts are let. And it seems like particularly the Toronto board, public board, seems to just be a carousel of a stepping stone to get into city council or provincial office. It's not about the classroom. It's no longer about the kids. It doesn't seem to be about delivering education, but it seems to be everything else in the media. I welcome these changes in Calandra, put in there as a problem solver, a strong communicator, and a get down to business leader. High time has come, and I'm happy to see it happening.
Yeah, Keith, I think there's a sense that the worry is you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and so the importance of having attention at a local level for education is lost if we don't do it correctly. On the other hand, this is an institution. The structure of school boards is quite frankly, on the verge of being 19th century or 20th century, early 20th century. And here we are almost a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and we still have the same kind of structure in place vis-a-vis education in Ontario. There's got to be a way of addressing the needs at a local level and still dealing with some of the concerns that Tim's expressed.
Well, they're not closing down the school boards just yet, are they? They're trying to make some better refinements, make them more accountable. And I particularly like in this legislation the fact that the minister will now have the power to tell boards to publicly post the expenses of trustees and the director of education and others in the board, and also give the minister, I don't know if this is important, the power over school names, that they decide they're going to change a name or build a new school. That's an interesting little tidbit. But I think the accountability aspect, Kathleen referenced the I think it was the Brantford Catholic Board that sent 4 trustees to Italy to buy statuary for the school. That's just utterly ridiculous. So I think if these trustees know they're going to have to post their expenses and make them public, they're going to be much more centered on the school board and the school board's needs. And if you do need some statues, I'm sure you can order them online without actually going to Italy to see them firsthand. The whole issue, I think Kathleen makes a very good point about MPPs are not in a position to deal with all the local issues at local school boards in their ridings. On the other hand, Dave, your point is that, well, the whole concept of school boards is quite antiquated, but it's been held up for so long for a reason, and that it does give people a feeling of local input. And while most of us may not know who our school trustees are, many parents do know, because they've had to take advantage or go to those people to get some help or assistance or whatever. So I think parents with kids in the system do know who their trustees are, and it's a very important role for them. So I think it's going to stay. I don't think government is ready yet to actually shut them down or get rid of them, but they're going to try and make them more accountable, and I think that's absolutely a good thing.
John,
I have an idea, Dave.
Yeah,
why
go ahead.
Why don't we get rid of city councils? Because they're antiquated too.
That was coming. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's just not we just had the King of England come and open Parliament. I mean, let's talk about antiquated structures and whether they're still useful. I just don't buy the argument that because school boards have been around for a long time that they're no longer useful. That's just not an argument that flies, because we've got lots of other levels of government and examples of abuse and stupidity and people not knowing who they're voting for. Don't tell me that every town councillor who's been in office for 35 years has gotten a conscious vote from their constituents, that they know who that person is and they've worked with them. I've sat in too many AMO meetings to buy that. So sorry, guys. I just think you're going to need another set of arguments. Dysfunction in an elected body, the longevity of the existence of the body, those are not arguments for getting rid of an institution.
No, but it's not an argument not to fine tune it. Otherwise, we'd still be driving Model Ts, right?
Of course not. There's always a need for improvement. Look, I was delegating to city councils last year about having requirements that they follow their own harassment rules, because municipal councillors were not doing that. So of course there needs to be improvement constantly, but that's not what this is about. This is about getting rid of this order of government because it's an irritant, and because this is a government, like the previous Conservative government, that really didn't have a lot vested in publicly funded education. They wanted a different model, and they didn't care about the traditions, and they didn't care about the access that parents would have, because that also is an irritant.
John, one of the things that I thought was a bit of an interesting inclusion in this discussion, and maybe a red herring because it took up a lot of media oxygen when the story first broke, and was that school boards would be required to include school resource officers where the local police service provided the service. This goes back to the whole Jordan Manners actually murder in Toronto, and that's where it all started, where we had police officers in schools. And if you believe the arguments of that, was a very vocal minority of people who screamed and yelled loudly enough to bounce them out. And we've just lost John. Bounce them out, Tim, and to say that was a positive thing in there. But it seems like a strange thing to include in this discussion around refocusing what's going on, or sharpening the focus around school boards.
So this is just the latest in a pattern of the province making more decisions when it comes to education. I mean, it actually started with the Ray government. We continued it under Harris, McGuinty Wynne government similarly, and now with Ford. And it's because it's not the dislike. It's reflecting that taxpayers have lost faith in our school board system, and I'll argue for very good reason. They would actually like to see police officers in our schools, particularly in areas where, there are concerns around public safety and security. The resources spent on, working to ban books or change names of schools instead of focusing on helping kids with special needs get attention in the classroom shows that this is on a wayward path. Look, I think this bill is the right thing to do. Keith mentioned some other features. It also actually has more transparency for the colleges and universities and how tuition is spent. It mentions children aid societies, accountability measures as well. Good for Paul Calandra. He was put in that ministry for a reason. He's no nonsense. He want to make change. And I think I will wager that this reflects where Ontarians are today, with a frustration with a badly broken system crying out for reform.
Keith, one of the things, though, that is included, and Tim alluded to it, was this opportunity for post-secondary students to opt out of some of the fees. And that was already tested early in this.
They tried that before, didn't they?
Right,
yeah.
Right.
And it didn't fly. The court struck that down. So they're coming back at it with new legislation to give students the option to opt out of some of their student fees. I guess that's something this government feels strongly about, but it's something, as I say, they tried before. The court said, no, that's not quite right. There's some of the schools and the students have worked out. So I think it's a blatant attempt to go back to where they were shut down before. And I'm not sure quite why they feel the need to do this. I don't hear a huge student, cries from university students. I don't see major protests at the university across the street from Queen's Park. I don't see students over there protesting about this. So I'm not sure quite what the government's motivation is on it, to be honest.
Well, I would have been a little
wasn't the last time, sorry, Dave, wasn't the last time that they were not, they had to opt in to the student fees? Wasn't that what the government tried to do? And that's what was struck down, Keith?
I believe that's right. Yeah, they had to opt in.
Yeah. I mean, it's political, right? They don't want students organizing. They want students not to have access to those fees to organize. Whatever. Again, I see that as a distraction from the fact that they're also taking $1 billion out of the college system, and it's way easier for people to talk about all those big bad student groups or those dysfunctional trustees than how are we actually undermining the future by not funding the programs that kids need? Again, I'm not saying there doesn't have to be reform and review and all of that, and maybe there's some college programs that needed to be cut, but colleges are dying on the vine right now. They are losing programs hand over fist. And yeah, there's money going into the training system, and that's good. But our college and university sector is very important to our economic well-being. And again, that doesn't seem to be something that this government is interested in addressing. The 10% tuition cut that they have frozen and not made the institutions whole has meant that these institutions are struggling to keep staff and keep programs in place. I think this other piece is a distraction from that.
Well, I would just say, just on the student fees, I would have been up in arms about it when I was at university if that were the case, because otherwise we may not have had CIUT-FM at the University of Toronto. Exactly. We fought for freaking months and months to get the referendum in front of the students to vote for it. We never would have launched that radio station, and here we are. That happened back in 1987 or whatever.
A hotbed of lefty ideas, Dave.
Well,
that's
right. Hey, we were the first radio station in Canada to have the gay community on the radio, actually talking about gay issues for the gay community. It was right, and nobody else was doing it. Now it's that's just part of the legacy. So. It's not a small thing as far as I'm concerned in terms of being able to manage that. All right, John Wright is back with us. I guess he got down the internet rabbit hole. John, wanted your take on where this was going with the just overarching. I know we've talked about the issue around school boards, but the whole issue around we need some level of reform because we keep having this conversation on repeat.
Well, and this is the second week where I've had internet issues. It's kind of like when you're looking at a screen like this and everything kind of goes in slow motion. You feel like that feeling when just before you're going to faint. You know, it's just kind of like it comes over you.
That's the effect we have on you, is it?
You kind of wait for it to happen. It was
The
shocking.
vapors.
Yeah. Well, let me just take it in a public opinion overarching sense as opposed to the details. I mean, I recall in 1990, 91, and 92 when it was the East York School Board, which caused great public consternation during that time frame. East York, particularly at that time, Dave Johnson, who was the mayor of East York and then became education minister, you know, was understood that behind closed doors, a group of trustees raised their own pay about 20% something like that, which then led to a whole series of but changes within the Harris government when they came into power. There were a couple of school boards that had done things. And there was a lot of public support for a lot of that. So we went through one phase and then we opened it up again. And I think we're back now to where that phase was before. I think what you would find in public opinion, quite different from Bill 5, which has a lot of potential detractors and a lot of intransigence that's going to have to be worked through, is that it's not like having a breakaway on the St. Lawrence, you know, like you've got free reign to do what you want to do. But the reality is that the public, in fact, believes that there is lack of transparency, that there is a huge amount of waste, and believes that there is great governance dysfunction with these particular bodies that are supposed to be operating in a particular way. And that's how the government is framing it. So I don't think that anybody's really at the stage where they're willing to accept a complete abolition of school boards. That's just going to have a different level of debate and intensity. But where the public is at clearly is that they don't believe that school boards, in terms of how they're spending their money, what they're spending their money on, they're being accountable. I mean, every time we run into this, it's kind of like, okay, we're going to shut down the pools. Well, you know where that's coming from. They're trying to, you know, we're going to take away, you know, after school projects that kids could have. No. That's not the issue. The issue is it being governed in a transparent and accountable way? And I think this is where the government's going to have lots of support to go in and do what they want to do.
Before we go, I want to get to this report on primary care physicians. And I thought it was really interesting, Tim, to see how this was done over a 30-year period. And they looked at it and, you know, per capita, we have more doctors being trained as primary care givers, primary care physicians in Ontario, but fewer of them are opting to stay in it or go into it and provide the service. And it you know, sort of raises an interesting conundrum, because until I saw these numbers, I thought, well, the answer is simple. You just, you know, incentivize people to get into the program. They're getting into it, but they're not staying in the actual practice. To me, this seems like, I don't know where the blind spot is here. I'm not suggesting that you would know, but it seems to me to actually peel the layer back and expose more of a problem that we might have otherwise thought we had.
Yeah, it's very helpful information. You know, I actually last week had the opportunity to speak at the Ontario Medical Association conference. They had me on a panel talking about effective advocacy. And, you know, what I picked up in those conversations and from the stage was really two things that sort of center around, you know, lifestyle. So you're always on the go, and you know, you've got to have knowledge across the board on service levels. So that puts attention to the system. Here's the other aspect. You know, doctors, family practitioners will report that they spend at least 17 hours a week filling out paperworks and forms and records. So they talked a lot about what kind of new technology they can use when they're actually with patients using AI, making sure you maintain confidentiality and accuracy, of course, that will relieve all the paperwork done after you see a patient, so you can focus more time on the patient, something called Scribe AI, which sounds like a really nice innovation. Secondly, the ability to work in teams and having other healthcare professionals working with the doctor, who can, you know, then use their areas of expertise and have the doctor focus on the most complex issues would be rewarding as well. And then there's a huge frustration they have that really, you know, as we've probably joked about before, fax machines have all gone to live in pharmacies and doctors' offices and seem to refuse to die. Their ability then to advocate for a patient to see a specialist really relies on whose number they know, using, WhatsApp, texting, knocking on the doors physically or electronically. The ability that we have to actually create a system where you could see which specialists have openings and get your patient in there quickly without that fuss of having to do it all yourselves on weekends and at nights, that would help bring some needed relief to the lifestyle in the system.
Yeah, Keith, we just talked about sort of the antiquated nature of school boards and so on. I mean, you can apply that to this system in many respects. I mean, when we start to talk about, whether it's the fax machines or the note taking and so on, and I agree that we need to kind of look forward on the tech that we can use to make these notes. My own experience with AI ChatGPT, you have to train it. So there would have to be something baked into this idea if we're going to take the notes and, make sure that it's taking notes accurately. But this cuts both ways, I think. It's easy to say there's an issue with government and government funding, and we're not really paying attention to the larger issues of the sector. But at the same time, doctors will push back when you say, well, okay, well, let's just kind of have a system where everybody's on salary as opposed to you being essentially self-employed entrepreneur. You have to run your business as a physician in your office. So that there are places in the system generally that both sides are kind of carving out and saying we're not willing to give up on that. And a little bit that is I think evident here, and it's exposed by the numbers in this report.
Clearly. I just want to say my doctor, I don't know if it's Scribe AI, but they're absolutely using an AI program. And they've asked me, I had a couple of visits with her, and she said both times she asked permission. You mind, I'm using this AI technology to take their notes, essentially, which is 17 hours a week. They're doing that. I think what we're seeing is a lot of doctors, you say, they're training to go into family medicine. And then as they get close to that time and they realize they have to set up a business, it's not, being employed by a hospital or being employed. They're going to have to set up this business, create an office. There's a lot of overhead to setting up, getting staff, all that kind of stuff. I think maybe perhaps that's deterring. There may perhaps needs to be more government programming to help them set up those offices, to get going as a business after you've trained for 7 years as a family physician. But I think a lot of it is they see other positions in their profession that just offer, to Tim's point, a better lifestyle for the doctor. And I think when it comes right down to it, they're seeing that there's just so many things that family medicine isn't getting directed or prioritized by governments, and so many other areas are, that I think a lot of them are opting to go to those other areas where there's more funding and there's more new tech being used. But as I say, the family doctor, my family doctor has got this Scribe AI or some sort of transcription service. It certainly didn't interfere at all in the examinations that we were doing. And to Tim's point, the clinic that I go to, I don't see those manila files all lined up in the back wall with all the different color coding for all the patients. They're doing most things electronically. And in fact, they just took a couple of pictures with their iPhone and sent them off to a lab to see if I do need to get referral to a specialist. So all of the specialists are being looped into this as well. So I think the technology is going to make a big difference. But I think there needs to be some directed government programming to actually see what the issues are with family doctors and why they're not staying in their chosen profession when they've trained specifically for that.
Yeah, Kathleen Wynne, the idea that, okay, well, we can pat ourselves on the back because we've put this amount of money into the system to train more physicians, to bring more physicians in from other jurisdictions. But, again, I think this is really revealing, and it's a little shocking that we're just sort of learning this now in terms of a trend over 30 years.
Well, I think there've been hints of it though for a while, Dave. I certainly remember, and Tim, you will know, working with the OMA, there are internal issues around the relative pay of family practitioners versus other specialists. That's been going on for a while. It was one of the big things we were struggling with at the end of our term in 2018. I think that the interdisciplinary model that Keith, that you're talking about, the other health practitioners, often they can find better paying jobs in other places, or the family docs are better off in the hospital. They can make more money. So, this is a really important wake-up call for the public. I don't think it's news to a lot of the people who've been working on this file. I actually think it's the reason that Doug Ford brought Jane Philpott in to try to work on creating more of these interdisciplinary and local hubs for family docs. But there's some fundamental funding issues around these different disciplines that they're going to have to be resolved. But I think it's very important that we're having a more general conversation about it, and that it not just come down to, well, we need to train more family doctors. I think it's good that we're going to the next level in terms of what's actually going on here.
Yeah, John, against the backdrop of the conversation that the premiers will be having with the prime minister next week, vis-a-vis, inter-provincial trade barriers, et cetera. But there's that whole thing about, labor mobility and moving across the country. And I remember being down in Nova Scotia, this a couple of years ago now, and the new government of the day had ads on the radio offering, guaranteeing nurses jobs, period. If you come here and you graduate, you've got your certificate, boom, we'll give you a job. So I can see that, if it's not treated effectively and urgently here in Ontario, there may be another province that comes up with it and says, okay, well, it makes more sense for you to come to Manitoba to be a primary care physician, and you're trained for it, and we'll give you the room to do the job you want it and the lifestyle you need.
Well, let me say that I actually did the polling for the Ontario Medical Association for almost a decade. I understand a lot of the issues that we're talking about today were still the issues that we were talking about then. In fact, having women in practice was a big issue. And during my time, they created the female outreach program to try and get more women into the profession, into different areas, and the focus on family doctors. So this is not a new demand. In fact, one could argue that the Ford government has tried to address it as best as they can. We have more people going into family medicine now than we ever have. The question in my mind is always whether they stay there, whether, this is a lifestyle issue and a workload issue. It's not just a paperwork issue. But what was fascinating about the report was that we're not losing doctors necessarily, Dave, to other jurisdictions or to other areas where they're not focused on the public, but they're moving to places like hospitals.
Right.
And it reflects, more flexibility, the ability to schedule, more of a, I don't like to say a 9-to-5 job, but they are there to be able to schedule time, less paperwork, all of those sort of things. So, it's a little bit like, I hate to make this analogy, but it's a little bit like you can incentivize all you want for daycare, for baby bonuses, for conditions for people to take mat leave, all of those sort of things within a system. And yet we're still more than a half a baby short in this country in producing more children. But women have decided, and their partners, to only limit how many kids they're going to have to maybe 1 or 2 at the most. So you can put all these incentives into the process, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can designate where people go. And this always gets back to that argument whether governments can do that sort of thing. So, I hate to sort of say time will tell the tale, but the government has put in a new medical school. We seem to be attracting more people into being doctors. But the question is whether or not, in terms of their ultimate choice, this fits their lifestyle as opposed to simply being in a profession. And I think that's what this report is pointing to, that they, in fact, they start out in a particular area, but they move to another area. That's what I saw in the report.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's leave it there. And that was a lot on the plate, a lot to digest. So we'll get back at it next week, and we'll just see where all of this lays and what's on fire and what ain't, as far as Bill 5, et cetera, is concerned. And I just want to note, for those of you watching on YouTube, I'm the only one who is properly dressed for this event today. I mean, the outfit, y'all can.
The Hawaiian shirt.
Yeah, well, we're into ugly shirt season, so I just wanted to let you know that.
Well, it's going to be humid, so there you go.
And if you're listening on the radio, if you know, you know. All right. Kathleen Wynne, John Wright, Tim Hudak, Keith Leslie, thanks for being here this week. And of course, as mentioned, yes, we are on the YouTube, so subscribe to the channel if you're watching. Pick it up on Apple, iHeart, Spotify. Make sure you follow or subscribe to the show there. And for those of you asking, when you subscribe on a platform, it doesn't cost you anything. Just click the subscription button, and it lands in your app as soon as we post the show. And if you're listening on the radio at News Talk 1010 in Toronto, yes, it's great that you're joining us and spending some time with us. But you know what? You probably missed about 25% of the conversation we had, because this is an edited version you're listening to on the radio versus what you get on YouTube elsewhere. I'm just saying. All right. Enjoy your weekend, the first weekend of June. How's that, right? We make the turn. Here we go. That's it. On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics Podcast. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network.
I have a YouTube channel right here, as you can all people see. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more content. Look at this. Bye now.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.